G'day, welcome back to the Sports Medicine Project, episode 92. I do wonder if anyone listening to this has been there since episode 1. Kelly and I were speaking about this before. We want to leave those episodes up because if I was to go back and record an episode now on something like dry needling or stretching or some topic we talked about very early on, it's amazing to think how different my explanations and analogies and thought process and critical thinking would be. And it shows like the only thing that is really constant as a health professional is the fact that you just have to update your ideas or the way that you think about something or the way that you do something. It's like the only constant change over the course of those 30 or 40 years. It's like similar to Ray Dalio and his book Principles, awesome book. I don't know if Gab listens to this. Follow her on Instagram, Learning Physiotherapy. She posted a photo of the Principles book, and it got me thinking. One of the quotes there that talks about like the only thing that is constant in the whole of life is evolution and just things changing and evolving and adapting. So I thought that was quite fair. So this episode, episode 92, Dr. Tim Gabbett, full episode. He's a pretty seasoned applied sports scientist, 25 years of experience. But before we get to what we talked about and also who Dr. Tim Gabbett is, just some housekeeping. I thought I would start the episode. I'm going to start every episode with this now, with just a little quick fact. I hope you're either driving somewhere, potentially you're driving maybe on a home visit, potentially driving to work, coming home from work, potentially going for a run, who knows. But hope you take this one fact, and if you learn nothing from anything that we ever create content-wise, I hope you remember this little fact. So this is from German Johannes, published in 2018. Misdiagnosed Liz Frank injuries can be as high as 50%. Conventional non-weight bearing radiographs can overlook up to 30% of unstable cases. MRI is the best overall imaging modality. So I thought that was pretty cool, especially the 30%. That's high, like 3 in 10 people. Potentially those subtle ones might not be picked up with a conventional non-weight bearing radiograph. So, dorsal midfoot pain with some bruising and swelling, potentially feeling unstable, and perhaps there was an acute injury or mechanism and it's not improving. Thinking Liz Frank, and it seems like an MRI is the best overall imaging. The sign that they say to look for would be the fleek sign, which is fleek or fleck. The way I tell the students to remember it is, I had a horse named Fleck, so I use that. But fleck sign, fleek sign, which is diastasis between the base of the first and fifth. Dr. Tim Gabbett is this episode to talk about lots of different things, but basically just talking about training load. So he's done a lot all over the world. He's got over 200 scientific articles published. He's got 2 PhDs, one in human physiology and a second in applied sports science. He consults, NRL, NBA, in the NFL. He does courses for the people that work for those organizations. If you head over to his website, which we'll put down in the show notes, he's doing courses around the world. He just is a wealth of knowledge. So focuses a lot around training programs and load management, rehab, maintaining athlete skills, how to perform, preparing athletes, talking about monitoring training load and how to potentially screen for injury risk, acute to chronic workload. And he's worked with the military, he's worked with the Olympics, so he's got a pretty good understanding. And one thing that's really awesome about this podcast is it's simple, but there's also some, I guess, for the people that want to nerd out on the load management stuff, there are certainly some nerdy bits in there that you guys will enjoy. But otherwise, it's a lot of practical information, a lot of information you can speak to people about, both clinicians and colleagues and also patients. But I know you guys are going to enjoy this one. If you guys like the podcast and the information we put out or any of the content, we've got more episodes over on our Patreon, webinars, research reviews, all that kind of thing. Or if you simply think that some of it's okay, you could leave us a 5-star rating, or you can support the show for 4 lollipops a month. So I think it's 2 colas, 1 strawberry and cream, and then 1 passion fruit. It's about $3 a month, and we'd really appreciate that. Otherwise, enjoy the episode with Dr. Tim Gabbett and have a lovely week. Welcome back, lovely listeners, to the Sports Medicine Project. Now, a very special guest today. We've got Dr. Tim Gabbett all the way up in Brisbane, and my co-host Kelly, of course. But welcome and thanks for coming on, Tim.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the chat.
Yeah, it's going to be good. Now, I was thinking, with all the people that we have on, it's very difficult to condense several years, 25 plus years of work into a couple of paragraphs, but you've been a pretty busy person, to say the least, over the last 25 to 30 years. I was having a look through your bio. You've got 2 PhDs, one in human physiology, a second in applied sports science. You've been on multiple podcasts and you've got over 250 peer-reviewed articles. Like, I've got one and I feel like it took me forever and I never want to go back into it again. Spoken over 400 national and international conferences. You've been involved in elite sport for a very long time, multiple Olympic Games cycles, and I was having a stalk of your Instagram only this morning, and you're actually a quicker park runner than Kelly and I. You're 18 minutes to 5K. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, a couple of weeks back, maybe a month or two ago, I dropped my PB to 18 minutes flat.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. Have you got a running background, or what's kind of been your background in sport and everything?
Yeah, look, when I was about 13 through to my high school years, I did a lot of cross country running and middle distance running, and my dad used to train me, and so that was probably the sport that I was probably best at. But in saying that, I was really just an average runner, maybe a little bit above average. I joke that I was blessed with 100% slow twitch fibers. But yeah, it's like at my age, you shouldn't be getting faster. So there has been a very deliberate change in the way I've trained over the last few years. So it hasn't happened by accident either. Like I've had to really, really work hard and really plan out my training well to get to that point. So if I get down in the 17s, I'll be pretty happy with that.
Has that been more strength training and plyometrics and things like that, or what's been the deliberate change?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's definitely. I've always, in recent times at least, I've always done strength work, and the strength work is important, no doubt about it. And I think from a running point of view, most people kind of think of strength work as the last thing that they'll put into their program, or it's the first thing that'll go if they have to drop something. Whereas for me, strength it's been critical to it. It's been a core part of the program. It's a non-negotiable thing that I will do. And if I have to drop away the strength at all, then I'll manipulate the volume and the intensity of the work that I do. And I might have a lighter day, but I'm still doing something. And there's reasons for me to continue my strength work. Putting on good weight has always been a challenge for me. So that's probably one reason why I want to keep doing it. But there's a lot of benefits behind doing strength and power training in terms of running performance. And a lot of people don't realize the benefits that come to middle distance, long distance performance through strength training and power training. So yeah, I'll do 4 lifts a week, but within that I'll have some tendon specific loading, and I'll also have some bone centric loading as well. So yeah, that's a pretty critical part. The other part too, but it is the actual running. So that the training has changed a lot from the way I trained when I was working predominantly with football teams, where a lot of the work you do is interval, high intensity, short, intermittent work, and I had to really change my focus to embrace the grind of the long, slow run, but also spend enough time at high intensities at or above race pace. or when I say above race pace, faster than race pace. Small amounts of time there, but enough time that it became normal to run that fast for long periods.
Yeah. Do you find, like, if you were to quantify somehow with like running intention, even for yourself, and I'd be interested to know if you wrote your own program or if you had someone else. It's always hard to write something for yourself. Do you find you use like a zone-based system, or a matter of kind of easy, moderate, or hard, or how do you kind of program? And I guess for intensity control, because we know that's a huge thing for people trying to monitor their load as much as they can. I mean, certainly in running, but kind of in any activity.
Yeah, well, look, I'm like most runners. I'll have a watch that allows me to record what I'm doing, but I'm not a slave to technology, and I'm a really big believer in running on feel. So different people have different ideas of how much low intensity zone 1, zone 0, zone 1 work you do, or zone 1, zone 2, depending on how you define it, and how much high intensity work you do. In general, what I don't spend a lot of time looking at pace on my low days. I generally have a low-high approach or a high-low approach, where the vast majority of my work is at low intensities. And those low intensity sessions are generally for distance, or for time, long, slow distance. So I don't look at the pace on my watch. It just, if I'm feeling any stress on that day, then I'm going too hard. So I slow it down. But then what that allows me to do, by keeping those low days low, it allows me to make my high days higher. So when I do go into a high day, mentally and physically, I know that I've got to prepare really well for that, because I know it's going to be a pretty tough day. But it's still not hours and hours of high intensity work. It's generally only short, small amounts of high intensity work that I do. But the vast majority of it is done on feel. My low days is done on how am I feeling today? Just keep it low stress. On my high days, I'm not even really that interested. I'll look at the splits or on my intervals, but I'm really just, if I'm having a high day, how much am I prepared to give myself today, and how close can I get to running as hard as I can for that interval? Some days are a little bit faster than others, but that's pretty much my approach. Have the small amounts of high days, and have a lot of low intensity work. 80% plus is low intensity.
I think it's really, not easy, but I think it's a lot easier to follow those sorts of guidelines for runners. But as we were talking, before we pressed record, you've done work with the ballet and with the NRL and basketball and a lot of those different team sports. How do you manage the intensity and low distribution in those sorts of sports? I imagine that's a lot harder to sort of control in a lot of ways.
Yeah, you're right, Kelly. It's if we take the NRL or AFL or even in the NFL, where we're playing one game a week, it's not that bad. You can use a high-low approach there. The high day is your game, and you want to have one other high day during the week, and you just base that high day around the expected time frame of recovery, the predicted time frame of recovery, and the response to training stress is relatively predictable. In that, we typically allow 3 days in and out of high days. So if Sunday is our big day, it's our game day, then we'll count forward and backwards 3 days from that. So it gives you Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Saturday, Friday, Thursday as one of your options for high days. Now, obviously not both. You don't want them both to be really high days, but that gives you an idea of how to plan your high-low within a week for those sports. If you're a starting pitcher in baseball, where you're only pitching once every 5 days, then that model fits pretty nicely for a high-low approach. You can pitch on day 1 and day 5, and then in between you've got some low intensity and some higher intensity work. But it becomes a little bit more challenging if you're in an NBA team or ice hockey, where you're playing multiple games in a week, back-to-backs, or ballet is another example of you might do 6 hours of training, 6 hours of classes and rehearsals a day, and the whole concept of planning and periodization in terms of training is relatively new. It's not, it's based on training, and classes and rehearsal are based on, this is the way we've always done it. This is, this is what you have to do. So, it'll take a little bit of time, but it's possible to periodize, to plan out high and low sessions within a week, even in a ballet context or in a basketball context. You can do it. It just takes some effort to do it.
Are you, like, in these teams? I mean, how are they quantifying these loads? Like, is there anything that's new, or I've heard you mention multiple times, like using things like RPE, or if you're running, potentially intensity and low and easy. Is there any benefit to going more into the data and things like accelerometers and vertical oscillation and things like that, and really quantifying that and then progressing that? Like, for the recreational people and the people that we're probably seeing in the clinic, not so much, but at the elite level, is there anything that they're doing that can kind of be translated down for the people that are managing the weekend warrior and progressing their training loads?
Well, I guess it depends on how interested you are in tracking training load. If you're really into it, then there's no shortage of toys that you could use, whether you're a weekend warrior or whether you're an elite level NBA player. Different groups, even in the NBA, even in the NFL, there's some groups who are very much into tracking and also tracking the load response. But then there's others who, have won recent Super Bowls, who still don't use GPS, which is, well, it's unique, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a different approach, but they've made it work. And I think a big part of it is making sure that you get your quarterback to the Super Bowl in relatively good form and in good shape.
Yeah.
But even sometimes then, quarterbacks can win it on one. The really good quarterbacks can win you a game on one leg. And it's just, all the GPS in the world probably isn't going to make much difference as long as you can keep that guy happy and being able to perform. Maybe the GPS isn't going to make a difference. So and the same thing goes at the lower end. If you can measure a whole lot, you still got to be able to make sense of it all, I guess. And I guess when I first started out in my career, I probably wanted to measure a lot more, and I think part of it was maybe having that reassurance of the number, but as time has gone on, I probably measure a lot less.
Do you think a lot of that, sorry, Tim, do you think a lot of that as well comes into the fact that we now have a lot more understanding about like internal loads impacting the overall load, like that measuring things in GPS and accelerometers and all of that sort of measuring their external loads, but we know that sleep and hormones and how you're feeling and your mood and your emotions, like all of that is going to be, stress is all going to be impacting your ability to cope with load. So that's something that's, you can use all of the gadgets, but they're still not going to be able to manage or monitor the internal loads.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And what you're talking about there is how health impacts capacity. So we think of capacity being you can improve capacity in basically one of two ways. You can do it through loading more, through progressive overload, and this is where your GPS units or your inertial sensors are really useful, you can put an external load on someone that's slightly greater than what they're accustomed to improve their capacity. The other way you can do it, and you've summed it up really well. It's only recently that it's really, people have started to pay more attention to it, is the health component. That if your sleep is poor, or if you're really stressed, or you're not hydrating or eating well, what that does is acts like a lever to pull your capacity down. Or another way of looking at it is, if your capacity is a cup, you're filling up that cup with a whole heap of stress, or a lack of sleep, or poor junky hydration and nutrition, before you even put the physical load on top of it. So you've only got so much capacity that you can deal with, or that you can use from day to day. So you've got to work out how you're going to fill that cup up. And you're right, that health component, it does impact adaptation. Absolutely, and it contributes to internal load. So the same external load, that same distance that you run, or the same weight that you lift, could feel a lot harder, a lot heavier, or it could feel a lot further, just based on the fact you haven't slept well, or you're feeling really stressed, you got a lot of lifestyle stress, or you haven't eaten or hydrated well. All of those things can act to pull down your capacity on any given day. It's a missing piece of the puzzle, or it has been the missing piece of the puzzle for a long time, I reckon.
Is there a way in which we think that happens, like without getting down to the cellular level, like to explain it to someone, a patient or an athlete? Like, is there a way? Is it perhaps your perception of the same loads, or your resiliency to tolerate it? Like, it makes definitely logical sense, but do we know kind of how it potentially made that happen, like from a nervous system or something to all the systems overall?
Well, what we're talking about is allostatic load. So we talk about external load being the distance that you run, the weight that you lift. Then we talk about internal load being the response to that external load. So it's either your heart rate response or your rating of perceived exertion. Then we're talking about allostatic load, which is all of this lifestyle load. It's the load that we're walking around with from day to day, and sometimes we're not aware of it at all, and then other times we're acutely aware of that allostatic load. And I would imagine you'll have some changes in the nervous system, plus you'll have some hormonal changes, and this is what makes even though the response to stress is fairly predictable, we're laying that training stress, we're overlaying that training stress on an underlying lifestyle stress, our day-to-day stress. So if our day-to-day stress is low and we're able to keep that pretty stable, then you'd expect that the training response will be highly predictable. However, not many people have that much control over that lifestyle stress and that lifestyle component. So you've got this very unstable surface that we're overlaying training on top of it. So the unstable surface is the lifestyle stress that comes with nervous system changes, it comes with hormonal changes, and then we're laying on top of that training stress that comes with nervous system changes and hormonal changes. So that's what makes the adaptations to training a little hard to say, well, we're going to peak at this specific moment in time, because there's so many things that we can't control, and that's allostatic load.
Yeah, I like that. I haven't heard that before, allostatic loads.
No, I haven't either, but I do like that too.
Yeah, good for I guess patients, easy to understand, because it makes sense when you explain it to someone, but we can't always expect someone like, oh yeah, Blake just said it's this loads, and because it's a bit hard for them it's not like as logical as what someone thinks. Like, how can I sleep poorly affect my response to going for a run? But as we're seeing it's definitely happening, like from a patient point of view, that is.
Yeah, well, look, if I'm working with, I probably don't talk about allostatic load to my patients, but or my rugby league players. But what I talk about is we've all got capacity is like a cup, and the cup we're trying to expand all the time. We're trying to expand the size of the cup so that we can actually do more. But that expansion doesn't take minutes or days; it takes weeks and months. But the shrinking of the size of the cup, so we can have these little increases and little decreases, but the shrinking and increases, the small increases and decreases, can happen from day to day just based on improvements or reductions in health. So then we've got to think of the cup as well. It's not the same size cup anymore. It's slightly smaller because we haven't slept well or we're dealing with a whole heap of stress. Equally, the flip side of that is it's slightly bigger when we control the stress and we manage to get some consistency in our sleep patterns. Or you could think about it in terms of filling up the cup. You've only got so much water you can put in a cup. You can fill it up with good load, or you can fill it up with bad load, the allostatic load, the stress, the lack of sleep. And you can only fill that cup up so much before it makes a mess. And the mess from a health standpoint is, you get excessive pain, or you get injury, or you get reductions in performance.
My cup was definitely bigger in the last 9 rounds of the NRL following the Knights. It was getting pretty big.
Stress levels low.
Yeah, life was good.
And then you can divide those cups into 2 and have your tissue-specific capacity and your sport-specific capacity, which is one of my favorite papers by yourself, Tim. And I reference it frequently with patients because, particularly like triathletes, for example, who have a huge amount of fitness, but they might not have the tissue tolerance to be able to handle the impacts of running, even though it feels really easy because their fitness is so high. And I think that's a really, I think that's a great paper, and I think it summarizes what we see a lot clinically. Can you elaborate on what I'm talking about from your perspective and how you see that relevance in clinic?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for the feedback on it. It was a really fun paper to write too. It only took a number of years to get it to that point, though, right? You see the last little bit of it, and it's only 800 words, but and even the graph in it, the original graph to what we got it to in the end was completely different. But essentially, we can look at local tissue capacity and sport-specific capacity being along a continuum. We all have general capacity, and at the extreme ends of that general capacity, I guess we can kind of conceptualize local tissue capacity down one end and sport-specific capacity up the other end. And you could have sport-specific capacity. And running, triathlon and middle distance, long distance running is a really good example of a sport where you can have sport-specific capacity. You might have the ability to run, and you might have the ability to run fast. But let's take tissue capacity in the context of bone. Now, bone is an interesting tissue in that after about 20 loading cycles, it goes deaf to further loading. So you can still be running, doing that consistent cycling of running, or consistent bone cycling of running, and you don't get further proportional increases in bone adaptation. So it switches off. It becomes desensitized to the mechanical stimulus of running. But you've got really good sport-specific capacity. So then you've got to think, well, if running isn't necessarily a great stimulus for bone, then how do we actually create local tissue capacity at the bone level? And this is where we can do bone-centric activity to try and stimulate further bone adaptation. So we'll do sport-specific activity that involves running, but we can do bone-centric activity such as small amounts of plyos, multi-directional plyos, that act to lay down more bone. They increase bone adaptation. So there's a really good example of, you can have really good sport-specific capacity, but if all you do is run, potentially you have poor local tissue capacity. Now, equally, if all you did was 20 to 60 plyos, multi-directional plyos, you're probably going to have really good local tissue capacity. But if you don't run, you'll get to the end of the street and you'll be fatigued pretty quickly. So you can have good local tissue capacity and poor sport-specific capacity as well. An overemphasis on either one of those results in either an inability to perform the demands of competition. So if you overemphasize local tissue loading at the expense of sport-specific loading, then you won't be able to perform your event. Equally, equally, if you do if all you do is sport-specific loading and you neglect the local tissue loading, then you can perform the sport-specific demands, but you probably just don't have the local tissue health underlying that.
I wanted, and I'm glad you brought up the example of running. I think about this often. I've spoken to a lot of people about it, even on the podcast as well, like talking, localized tissue and sports specific loading. The argument for someone wanting to do any activity, whether it be running or water polo or anything that they want to do, if you're able to control the dosage of that sport, you can just load them in that manner. But obviously this is different for tendons and bones. As an example, if you want to get someone better at running, what's going to be the best way for them to do that? It's going to be for them to do more running and progress over time. Can you just be really controlling of that dosage, because that's going to be the best way to then increase that over time, and they get better than running instead of doing stuff at a local tissue level? But kind of based off what you're saying, there's definite benefits outside of that tendons, bones, with doing sport-specific stuff, but also localized. And then the argument would go from runners saying, well, I don't need to strength train because I want to get better at running, so I should just do running because the best way to get better at it is to do more of it.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly an argument for that, and the whole train the way you want to play. That argument, it's done in team sports, it's done in individual sports. I guess an extreme view for a team sport athlete is, well, don't actually break down the physical qualities that you need to be able to perform your sport. Just play the sport, right? And but what that means is, we think it's a very sport specific stimulus, but actually it's probably more of a general stimulus, because you're not actually able to target any specific physical quality. And if you can't target any specific physical quality, then you won't be targeting the factors that are limiting performance on an individual basis. So let's take running as an example. If strength training is one of those things where people go, well, I don't want to do strength training because I just want to run. Running will make me better. The argument I'd say is, well, if you've got weak calves, weak soleus, then by the time you get halfway into your race, rather than having a midfoot strike and loading and then levering off the ground and spending less time on the ground, what you'll end up doing is you'll end up having more of a rear foot strike. You'll spend more time on the ground. You'll be dragging your feet. You won't be kicking your feet up at the back. So you're actually working harder to produce the same pace, or you just can't produce the same pace. Whereas having stronger calves, stronger soleus, stiffer tendons, it allows you to run more efficiently. You can produce the same speed at a lower cost. You can't target soleus strength just through running alone. You will get a certain amount of soleus strength from it. You'll get a certain tendon stiffness, but targeted strength and conditioning programs will give you a better result than no strength training alone. Now, we know there's the the injury reduction benefits of strength training. It tends to go across pretty much every sport. But there's also the, if you're not interested in injury, just look at it from a performance enhancement point of view. If you want to run fast and you want to run economically, then incorporate strength and power training into your program, and your running will go through the roof as a result.
How are you assessing for local tissue health? Are you just doing generalized like strength assessments, or assessing their power? Like, let's say in a non-injured runner who doesn't have a deficit from left to right, how are you assessing whether they need to work on something in particular, or are you just sort of generally recommending to be doing some sort of heavy calf loading, some sort of heavy squat, deadlift, plyo work?
I just wanted to add to that. Do you think it's necessary for clinicians to do these tests with measurable outcomes like force plates and actuals and the VOLT and things like that, or is it enough to be able to get their perceived exertion and watch them and assess them in just visually, with your eyes or on a phone or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I could probably put the question back to you, Kelly, because you would do this regularly, I would imagine. With, one of the things that we do with runners is, and we're returning someone to running following injury, is we want them to be able to do a certain number of single leg heel raises, and 25 tends to be the number that gets thrown around. Now, I can do 25 single leg heel raises, so it's not something that's particularly onerous. But if you can't, one way of looking at it is if you have this benchmark for local tissue loading, and local tissue loading is just, or local tissue capacity is just isolating a particular tissue or structure. So what we're trying to do there is isolate the calf. If you can't do 25 single leg heel raises, then that's a pretty good indication then that you're not prepared to go out and start running your 5K park run, because you're going to be hitting the ground at forces much greater than that body weight force that you're experiencing in the 25 calf raises. So the 25 single leg heel raises is kind of your bare minimum that you want to be able to do, and that's your bare minimum local tissue capacity. Now, that's kind of one way to assess it. We can assess it in a whole heap of different ways. With you can either use technology or you don't use technology. So for something like a heel raise, I'd be pretty comfortable just looking at can they actually do the reps? Do they have them under control? And I wouldn't be too worried if I didn't have the technology to quantify that on a force plate. If I'm working with a higher level athlete and the stakes are a lot higher, then maybe we do some more sophisticated testing. Maybe if I'm working with a sprinter, maybe there's a certain force we want to achieve on a Nordic hamstring curl. If I'm working with a rugby player who has to absorb and generate lots of forces in a scrum, then I'll want a certain amount of soleus strength, and the soleus strength per body weight needs to be really high. But I think you can do a lot of these tests. They're kind of like your minimum standard that you want to do in order to progress that athlete back to full performance, whatever that looks like for the sport.
And then tailoring that to them, like as a minimum, because you see some people that, they can run 40, 50 Ks a week and struggle to do a couple of calf raises. And it's just incredible. And you couldn't say, oh, your risk of injury is so much higher, that logically it would make sense from a pure tissue capacity level. Do you find that people, like in your experience when you've worked with, hundreds and hundreds of sporting teams, individual athletes, that there is more buy-in from them if they're seeing the numbers or seeing them improve, or they can see what they're doing, or you found that they don't probably care that much and it's just something that they just work on and do it anyway? They just want to play the sport and do what they enjoy.
Oh, look, it varies from person to person. I think from experience, the athletes who tend to stay a little bit healthier are the ones who tend to load across the continuum. So they will be doing their sport specific loading, and we hear things like nothing prepares you to sprint like sprinting. And there's nothing that puts the hamstring under stress like sprinting. There's no exercise that we can do in the gym that gets remotely close. So there's two ways you can interpret that. You can say, well, all we're going to do is sprint, or you can go, well, what happens if that athlete gets injured on day 2? How much sprinting are we doing with that athlete? We want to be loading them, but if nothing prepares them to sprint like sprinting, why don't we just start sprinting them? Well, it doesn't work like that. We've got to progress them back to sprinting. And that's where a lot of this local tissue loading I see comes in really handy. It's understanding that you're not going to elicit the same muscle activation in those exercises, those isolated exercises, as you would in sprinting. But that's exactly the point, because if it was all 100%, then you wouldn't be able to do it at any point when you're injured. So having a lower activation for a lot of these exercises acts like these are the building blocks that actually get us back to sprinting. We can't just go from being injured on day 0 back to 6 weeks later being able to sprint. There's got to be something that fills in those gaps, and that's where local tissue loading becomes really important. One, it's a lower intensity, it's a lower muscle activation, producing less force in those activities, so it allows you to progress. But they act like milestones, that if you can't do those exercises, then there's no way that you're prepared to handle the most extreme demands of sprinting. So they're little benchmarks or milestones you've got to hit along the way to say, okay, we've earned the right to progress now.
Yeah, it's kind of a micro version of the acute to chronic workload ratio, I suppose, which is another thing that I was interested to talk to you about, which I think a lot of physios listening to this, that's probably not the first time that they've heard it.
And podiatrists, give us a break. Come on.
For like the athletes listening or people that aren't familiar with the acute to chronic workload ratio, can you rehash what that looks like and what that means?
Well, the whole concept of the acute chronic ratio is essentially we're asking, is this athlete, whoever the athlete is in front of us, injured or healthy, are they ready for the load that we're about to give them? Have they trained enough in over a longer period of time to be ready for the load that we're about to give them today? And essentially what we're talking about is loading relative to someone's capacity. Capacity is chronic load, and the acute load acts as the load that we're going to apply right now. Now, for a long time, I don't know that anyone was really having that conversation. We were returning athletes back from injury, and we're doing one-off sprint tests, or we're doing hop tests. And we're saying, oh, well, he's either right to return or he's not. But no one was actually saying, well, hang on a second, has he trained enough to handle the demands of play? Has he done enough loading over a more consistent period of time? Is his chronic load high enough to set him up to handle the demands of competition? So that's essentially what the acute to chronic workload ratio does. It just asks, are you prepared for the load that we're about to give you?
Now you are. Oh no, you asked that question. Not what you're going to ask.
Well, I think it's good because it sort of justifies what we know about chronic workloads being, I guess, in some ways more protective of injuries. Like again, like if we take it back to runners, you look at someone who's running at a higher mileage, and you think, well, the general person might think that they might be at risk of injury. However, it's actually probably the opposite. So it's that chronic workload that's more protective in them against injuries. So is that sort of getting to that point as well?
Yeah, you're right, Kelly. I mean, I have this conversation with different members of my family, typically the in-laws, and they'll typically tell me, you're training too hard, you're going to break. And like I don't get into many arguments with the in-laws.
Christmas is coming up too. You'll have to be prepared. Have a couple of studies on standby.
Well, I mean, if we're talking about fixing a car or we're talking about building a house, I kind of just let the experts talk about those things. But when we talk about training, I feel like I can hold my own. So it's kind of one of those conversations where we go, well, actually.
You can start sending out like pre-readings before Christmas. Just come across these papers and then we'll discuss at Christmas dinner.
There might be a study or two that I can refer you to here. Well, look, it's a really interesting question, right? Is it chronic load? So is it load that protects people from injury, or are we just observing a survivor bias, right? So that it's not actually that the higher chronic loads set you up to stay injury free. It's the fact that you're injury free that allows you to accrue higher loads.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Right. And look, if I had the choice of sending someone out to do a job with really low chronic loads or really high chronic loads, I'd take the latter every time. Because I do believe that when you've trained over a longer period of time, you're much better prepared for what you're about to do. Whereas if you're in the basement, it's a long way away from the ceiling. And it's a long way away. If you're in rehab, it's a long way away from the demands of the game. So taking someone with higher chronic loads, I do that every time compared to someone with lower chronic loads. Now, so let's assume then. Well, let's just take. We won't say whether it's causal or not, because at the moment it's difficult to say, because no one's actually done a randomized controlled trial and they've gone, we're going to intentionally build chronic load here, and we're going to intentionally keep another group's load low. That doesn't happen very often in sport. If a coach believes that high chronic loads are going to benefit the team, then the whole team's going to do it. They're not going to do an RCT. So it's pretty hard to do an RCT on this. But let's just take out the possible causal link and say that it's associated, that high chronic loads are associated with injury. Now, that in itself is a really interesting finding, because it goes against everything the textbook was telling us about training load. If you pick up any textbook, it would tell you that high training loads are the cause of overuse injuries, overtraining. So if we go back 10 or 15 years, and I know Cricket Australia have copped a lot of flack in the media over their bowling rotation policy, the bowling workloads. Now, I don't know whether it's fair. The media typically evaluate things they don't understand, and they don't have the full picture that the people in the teams have. And in my experience is people in sport are doing a pretty good job of trying to keep players healthy. But there was a school of thought there that if we just manage a bowler's workload, if we try and keep their bowling workloads in training, we keep them to a minimum, then we can get them to game day and we get them there in one piece and they're ready to perform. But the results of our first ever project looking at acute and chronic loads showed that when you manage a player like that, when you wrap them in cotton wool, manage them away from bowling, their risk of injury is almost 10 times greater.
Wow.
Than if you get them to higher chronic workloads. And the second finding there was, the first was that chronic load was associated with lower injury risk. If you could get to higher chronic workloads, you had low injury risk. The second part of it was you can't just go from 0 to 100. You have to try and get them to those higher chronic workloads in a safe way. If you ramp them up really quickly, that increases the risk of injury. So essentially what we've done there is we've sent them out to do a job that they're unprepared for. We've asked them to do something that's much greater than what they've been prepared for over a longer period of time.
Mm.
Yeah, it's like that study in the NFL with that lockout period. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and they like have I talked to you about
No.
this yet? No. So like the average amount of Achilles ruptures per year was 4. And then there was this random lockout period in 2011, I think it was, where they missed a bunch of preseason training and they had like 12 Achilles ruptures in the first
Yeah, wow.
4 weeks, I think, of getting back into training, which was pretty crazy. So it was sort of just, highlighting exactly that. Like they just didn't have the chronic workload or that base to allow them to jump into the higher demands of sport.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably a few explanations, and we can't monitor them all, and we can kind of speculate on a few, but definitely a spike in load on the back of a pretty low base. You would think that probably did contribute to the higher rates of Achilles ruptures, and they're starting to see, from what I hear, this year they've had a lot of Achilles ruptures in the NFL compared to previous years, and we're only a third of the way through the season.
I wanted to ask, Kelly and I were in hot debate just before this podcast as we were having lunch. What I couldn't understand, I think it's just for me being naive. If you're loading someone, you impose a stimulus on a tissue or the body, you give it time to recover, and therefore it adapts, and you repeat the cycle lots and lots of times. If you're imposing a high chronic workload, are you not giving the system enough time to recover compared with it was lower? So then the ability to then handle an acute spike would be a little bit higher if you've had low chronic workloads in the past. Like, does that make sense? Or it's not what we're seeing in the research though. So having that higher load is protective, not in the sense of if you've had a lower load, you're not more prepared to then take on a new stimulus.
There's a few little takeaways in there, right? So let's talk about high and low chronic loads. Look, I think high chronic loads are associated with lower injury risk, and I think it does it in a few ways. One is when you train consistently, you develop physical qualities, and so aerobic fitness, strength, these physical qualities, pretty much in 9 out of 10 studies, they will show they protect against injury. You have a lower risk of injury when you're fitter and stronger. The other thing that you get when you train consistently is chronic load increases, right? And chronic, we've shown in some studies that chronic load is independently associated with a lower risk of injury. And the third is, I think by having a higher chronic workload, it's kind of self-limiting, in that when you're in the basement, when you have low chronic workload, the only way is up. So it's much easier to spike training loads when you're in the basement than it is when you're at the ceiling. Because I don't know if you've ever done this, where you're actually training regularly and you're really throwing a lot of load at yourself. It's very hard to add more load on top of that. You're just too tired to do it. So going out and, if you're running 100 kilometers a week and then adding another 50 kilometers on top of that, it's near impossible to do it, because you just don't have the time, and you're too tired to do it anyway. So it's kind of 3 things I think probably help there. Now, but tied in with that is you're talking about super compensation, where we load, we provide a recovery period to the tissue or the system, and then we load again. In general, that process is fairly predictable. It varies a little bit on health status and training status, but if you're training high intensity, high stress, anaerobic type training, or you're doing sprinting, that's highly eccentric activity for the muscle, you're going to require 72 hours recovery between those sessions. Some athletes maybe can do it every 48 hours. Some of the real fast twitch fiber athletes that I train, they might need a little longer. But roughly we can say 72 hours is what you'll need. But different tissues will respond differently to that stimulus. So tendon loading, we could probably load a little bit more frequently, but it's also intensity dependent. Bone loading, depending on the type of bone loading. If we're doing low level cyclical movements such as running, we can have a short refractory period of 4 to 8 hours, and then we can go back and do some bone centric plyometric type activity. But then you still need some recovery time after that bone centric activity. So different tissues will respond differently to a stimulus as well.
I think I won't be coming over for Christmas. I think you just defeated me in that argument. I'll have to bring that up. That was one I didn't think of it. It's funny you mentioned that. I'm at my peak at the moment running 80 kilometers a week, and it's the most I've ever run consistently. And I'm like, there is no way in hell I could go anymore. Like, it's a good example. Like, just as you were saying that, it would be very difficult for me to then add on top of that going from 70 like a couple of months ago.
Yeah. I mean, I've done a couple of 100K weeks, and like when you're getting up around 60, 70, 80 kilometers on a regular basis, you know what it feels like. By the time you get to your day off, you're kind of hanging out for a
you can't wait to go. Thank God, I love running, but I can't wait not to run today.
You're looking for that recovery. You're not looking for more work in general.
Yeah. What would you say for the clinicians listening to this, and the majority of our listeners are in their first 10 years of practice, actually they're based off the stats in their first seven years. What would you say is a way for someone to monitor someone's response to loading and progress them from an injury? As you said, you've spoken about RPE. Do you have people kind of rate what their RPE is with their sessions that they're doing, and do you think that's effective for clinicians to be able to monitor over time and seeing how it's going? And I guess if the goal is to slowly spike someone's load with progressive overload, that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the session RPE is our best, most least expensive method of monitoring internal load. There's different. We will get to a point where we can quantify internal tissue loads, but I don't think we're necessarily at that point now. And the session RPE in its current format, just asking how hard was that session, it won't get the answer that you want in terms of local tissue loading or local tissue capacity. So what you might have to do is change the wording of the question to how hard was that session on your calf, or how hard was that on your Achilles, right? So that's kind of your load measure, but it's internal load. When we talk about response, then that's kind of the next thing that we need to look at is, well, what is a normal response? What is an appropriate response to load? And an appropriate response to load varies according to tissue and system. So we could give a sprinting session, for example, that we know is going to involve eccentric muscle actions. It's going to involve stretch, shorten cycle activity for the tendon, and it's going to involve bone loading. Now, those three different tissues have different time frames of recovery. So a muscle, we typically give 72 hours recovery. Tendon, the tendons typically feel good when they're loading, and they like consistent loading, but they're very much intensity dependent. So the higher the intensity, the greater recovery time you're going to need. If you're going to get a reactive tendon, it'll feel good in the 24 hours post training, but it's typically in the 48 hours post that you'll get the reactive tendon. So just resist the urge in that 24-hour window. Just wait another 48 hours before you go back and do a similar type of loading. And then bone is different again. It can have quite short recovery times, depending on if it's low intensity work, or it can require longer recovery times for higher intensity work. So we're talking about three different types of responses for the exact same load. So you could be potentially optimally loading one tissue and suboptimally loading another. And what I would say there is just pick the rate limiting tissue. pick the one that's the most important for you at this point in time. If you've got someone with a bone stress injury, then you might have to wait 5 days where they're pain-free on normal activities before you go back and load them again. Now, that means that you're going to be suboptimally loading the tendon and suboptimally loading the muscle, or you've got to find another way to load the tissue, the tendon and
That's
muscle.
good. That's really...
Now, the response is the response that we look for. There's a whole heap of different responses, but if you're experiencing some muscle soreness or some muscle tightness after a sprinting activity, then that's a normal response to training. If you are experiencing pain or there's sharpness that happens when you walk, or when you stretch your legs out, then that might indicate that you might have overdone it. Now, the way we assess whether it's a normal response is if we want to just focus on muscle, we train on the Monday. Then we come back on the Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. We plan to do another high-intensity session then, another similar dose. If we're still feeling sore, still feeling tight, and can't move from Monday's session, then that indicates that it's an inappropriate response, right? So we've got a decision to make. We can adjust the program by giving more warm up and activation, maybe some soft tissue work before going into the set, or we might move the set to later in the day, or we might give an extra day's recovery before we load again. So then we just follow the response to that. We load, and then when we go back to load again, have we returned to a relatively normal baseline so that we're ready to receive the next loading stimulus.
And then seeing, I guess you could track over time that response, and is it shortening or widening or staying kind of the same?
Yeah, absolutely. And the response will vary a little bit depending on the tissue. It'll vary depending on the system. So things you look for with a tendon might be slightly different from a bone or slightly different from a muscle. But essentially, I think a lot of the time the subjective measures that we take, just asking our athlete how they feel and asking some pretty pointed questions, gives us the information we need.
Do you have the question that you generally or commonly ask to have somewhat of an assessment of someone's kind of psychological readiness, other than probably what they're telling you and how they're feeling? And I mean, other than just asking the question, how are you feeling and prepared to do this? And I guess seeing lots of clinicians and lots of active people, you do inherently get a feeling for some people that are, more protective, and some people that are more going to shoot a little bit over the top. But is there anything that you've found that gives you a bit of an idea as to how they're feeling? And if we're knowing that has such a big implication, other than, RPE and just talking to the person as well?
Look, I think there are questionnaires out there that can kind of assess psychological readiness or resilience. For me, I'm kind of lucky in that I get to work with people on a fairly regular basis, so you get to know them pretty well. You observe things when they're healthy, and things that they do with their training habits when they're healthy, and that kind of helps you a little bit when you're bringing them back from injury. But whether I'm working with a healthy athlete or bringing someone back from injury, the process is pretty much the same for me. It's finding out what makes that person tick, like getting a feel for some of the things they feel comfortable doing, getting a feel for the things they don't feel comfortable doing, and helping reassure them that potentially they could be in pain. They're experiencing sensations of pain, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're injured. And equally, some of my athletes, may not cope with fatigue as well as others. So, helping them understand that fatigue's just a sensation. You can go into that place, and it's not an unsafe place. You can go into that fatigue place. You can find something you didn't realize you had. Just because you get fatigued doesn't mean you're going to get injured. Just because you're in pain doesn't mean you are injured. But ultimately I think it's about listening to them and letting them share their experiences, tell their story, and where appropriate, try and respectfully challenge it, work with their beliefs where you can, and just understand that it's not just a physical thing that we're talking about now. Like injury can be physical, and we have to calm the tissue down before building it back up. But a big part of that rehab process is calming the brain down before building that person back up as well. And just acknowledging that you've got a person in front of you. It's not just black and white on a piece of paper or a program that you've written out. Do this. We're constantly kind of adjusting on the run and working with our athlete.
There's been heaps of different elements that we've touched on. What's when you're working with a team, what's a good practical example of how you're assessing their load, from the start? If you just start working with them, are you what are some common mistakes that they might be making, and how are you adjusting for that? Or are you focusing more on the sort of psychological aspect of load management and getting through injury and pain? Or what does that typically look like as an example?
Well, let's talk about a healthy group. Typically we would bring a healthy group back in day one of preseason, and we'll have a number of physical tests that we want them to be able to do. And whatever the test is, it could be a 1,200 meter shuttle run for a rugby league player. It could be a 2 kilometer time trial for an AFL player. Now the one way that I like to actually get a feel for how much they've done in their off season, how well they've been prepared, that will actually tell you a little bit. But what I like to do is give them a break and then get them to do it again. And then just look at the gap between their first one and their second one, and whether they get spat out the back badly in the second one. The players who've done a bit in their off season, done a bit of work, they'll kind of shake it off. As soon as you say, all right, we're doing another one, they'll shake it off and they'll get their head around it, and then they'll attack it and get after it. And then the ones that haven't, if they haven't been found out in the first time trial you do, they'll definitely be found out in the second one. Now, the way you deal with that then can set up your preseason. Now, rugby league is a really good example of it's out of any of the sports that I work with. It's a very tough sport, and there's no place for boys in the sport. You've got to come ready. Now, if you turn up to day one of preseason and you're not ready, then I've got a couple of choices. I can lower the training to everybody's capacity or to the lowest common denominator, or I can say, well, look, this is where we are at the moment is a long way away from where we need to be. I'm going to set a higher standard. Right, we're going to set a higher standard from day one, and typically that's what I'll do. And not to the point where if they break, they break, and I don't care. That's certainly not the case. I care a lot about my players and keep them healthy, but I also want them to know that there's a line in the sand here, that there's no easy way to get to good performance. There's no easy way to get to the standards that we want to get to other than hard work. So if they get spat out the back in the first session or two, that's okay with me. I'm expecting it because I'm setting the standard pretty high, but I don't have to say anything to them either. I don't have to say, well, you're off the pace, or you've been lazy in your off season and this is the reason why you're getting spat out the back. They know the reasons why they're getting spat out the back. They don't need me to tell them, but all I just say to them is, stick with me, you're going to get better. And it generally happens pretty quickly. Within 3 weeks, you'll start to see a team. The whole mindset of the group changes. They start to attack training a little bit more. They're not in survival mode. They're getting after the training, and typically after 3 weeks, you've got a group there that are pretty hungry for work.
Now you mentioned something there that was a pretty controversial topic on our social media with the recent AFL and NRL grand final, but you did say you've got to be a pretty tough person to play NRL. Could that be potentially you hinting that NRL is we had a poll come up to say which is the overall, do you have to have more capacity, strength and aerobic fitness and all that kind of thing? Who's the better overall athlete, an NRL or an AFL player? And I was surprised. I thought I posted some all right content, but I've never got more replies other from that story. There was a lot of opinion going around. And you don't have to comment on this, but with everything that you know, what do you think as a broad statement, who's the better athlete there? Because there's lots of different aspects of it, but overall.
Yeah. What did people say? Did they say AFL or rugby league?
Everybody said it was, funnily enough, 85% to AFL to 15% NRL. And we've got a pretty even distribution of people on the East Coast, but the kind of overarching theme was for NRL more, more power, and AFL obviously more aerobic fitness. NRL broader athleticism, required more cardiovascular strength, power, mobility, contact resilience, and muscular endurance, whereas AFL is you've just got a greater cardiovascular capacity, both aerobic and VO2. And that was kind of roughly the gist. But I'm like, well, you need power in AFL. You've seen them jump how high, and power to weight ratio, I'd imagine.
Yeah, I mean it's a great debate, isn't it? It's and it's all like your responses there, I think are really, they're spot on. I guess it depends on what you define as your athletic quality. If we're talking raw strength and power, then rugby league players and acceleration, probably top end speed for your outside backs there. You've got some physical specimens there, but in terms of aerobic fitness, the fittest player in rugby league would probably be middle of the pack in the AFL, middle to low end of the pack in terms of aerobic fitness. So you're talking two very different sports. I mean, I grew up on rugby league, and there was no AFL when I was growing up where I grew up. It's a lot more popular in Queensland now, but so for me, it's in my blood. I've been around it so long that there's just things I really love about the game, rugby league. But I can definitely admire what AFL players do. And this it's not just the aerobic component. You got to be strong. You got to be powerful. The players today do a lot more strength and power work than they would have done 20 or 30 years ago. You just look at the players; they're all round athletes.
Yeah, I was pretty similar. I grew up in a rugby league town. I also like to joke and say rugby league players are probably nicer and better looking and wiser, but we'll leave that to another podcast. I did want to ask him, we'll kind of put them throughout some of the listener questions, which there was a lot of as well. So I had to certainly take some out, and then they were kind of similar to what we had asked. But someone asked, which I get this question a lot. We both do with seeing and posting lots of running and training load content, but the pitfalls generally of just this 10% rule, which I kind of thought we'd maybe forgotten about it, and I didn't really see it brought up much, but people generally tend to use it as a blanket statement. What do you see that the problem with that as from your point of view?
Well, there's a couple of things with the 10% rule, and the first is that if you type in 10% rule into Google, you'll get 3 different definitions of the 10% rule.
Yeah.
One says don't increase load by any more than 10% per week, which is probably the most common. Then you'll get don't increase intensity by more than 10% per week, which is completely different from load now. And then the third is don't increase intensity by any more than 10% each session, which by the end of the week you've got potentially 70% increase in load, or intensity. So there's obviously you can't call it a rule if there's that many different definitions. So at best it's probably a guide. But the main thing for me is that it doesn't take into account your athlete's capacity. So if you've got someone who is at the ceiling, you've got a highly trained ultra endurance triathlete who's training 30 hours per week. Try putting 10% on top of that person. It's near impossible, but I can guarantee you they still want to improve capacity. But chances are, if you get 0.1 or 0.2% increase in load, that's a real win for that athlete. And equally, someone who's been in bed rest for 10 years, 10% could be a lot compared to where they've been. And you need to keep in mind that 10% of nothing is still nothing. So if you use the 10% rule, it's going to take you a long time to get to where you want to go. If I'm running 1 kilometer per week, and I use the 10% rule to get myself to a 10 kilometer race, that's 26 weeks to get there, which could be perfectly normal and perfectly acceptable for someone who's been in a bed rest. But if all you've had is 1 week while you've been on holidays at 1 kilometer, and the preceding weeks have all been 10, 20, 30 kilometers per week, then using the 10% rule is not going to be appropriate in that instance. There's studies that have of runners that have used the 10% rule or a faster ramp rate to get up to a 10 kilometer race, and at the end of it, there were no difference in injury rates. It was around about a 20% injury prevalence for both groups. So what it tells us is, at least for short periods of time, you can handle larger increases in load than 10% per week. And if I've got someone who's moderately trained, reasonably good chronic load, I'd have no problem in ramping them up higher than 10% per week.
Yeah. And you'll ask people, if you're seeing them, what's been your training loads in the past? Like, not just the last 12 weeks, but, the last several years. What did you do when you were younger? Did you, specialize when you were younger? Did you train when you were pre-pubescent, post-pubescent, all that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, we try and get a little bit of a history. At very least, we want, if someone rocks up on following an 8-week off season to day one of preseason, we don't really know what they've done. We've given them a program to do, but it's up to them to do it. We can't enforce it. So, one of our initial screening stations is just asking them, well, what have you done over the last 4 weeks? Have you trained regularly, or have you done nothing? So you get, and you'll always have people who'll make stuff up, but for the most part, a big part of what we do, whether it's in a clinic or whether it's with a sporting team, is you have to develop relationships with the people in front of you. And part of that is just being honest. And for the most part, players are pretty honest they'll tell you if they haven't done anything, or if they haven't done as much as they should have.
Yeah. Did you have any more questions?
No, I think we've asked all of the questions.
Yeah, quite a lot, plus more. Plus the listener questions. Mate, thank you so much for coming on. Now, for people to find courses, social media, what's going to be the best way to be able to find that? I know your website's got all your details and profiles and courses and things coming up, but anywhere else they can kind of find you and things you're up to?
Yeah, look, I'm doing courses all over the place. I'm happy to be heading back to Tassie in November. So that looks like it's going to be a really good workshop down there in Hobart. But if most of the time I'll put either my own training or research up on different social medias. So either LinkedIn or Twitter or Instagram. Yeah. So
are you on Strava?
I am, but it's one of the only things that I keep private.
I was wanting to see you go down and smash out a sub 18-minute park run down in Tassie the morning of the course. You just get everyone there and go, we'll just take it easy. Then you just shoot off and go, oh, that's my easy pace.
Well, this is the thing, right? Because most people don't realise that I'm in the race. And I'm not saying that Tim Gabbett's in the race. They just kind of see this old guy and they go, well, he's not anything to worry about. And by the time they realise that I'm in the race, that I'm going as hard as I can, and I am racing you. That kind of the races that they haven't clicked.
Yeah.
And like some of them are too good, they're just too fast. But by the time some of them work out that we're in this race now and it's game on, it's kind of too late for them to change their mindset.
Yeah, they just had no mental readiness, and from a couple of Ks out, you're coming. What shoes are you racing in? Are you in the race shoes?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I train just in some Pegasus, and so they're a bit heavier. And if I'm feeling pretty leg heavy and I feel like a reward, then I'll bring out the Vaporflies.
Yeah, nice. Good to hear. Good to hear.
But typically I train in my slower shoes and race, and I just break out the super shoes for the race.
Yeah, that's good. It's been a pretty incredible last couple of years with shoes and racing and running. Like, it's the technology and things like that. I work at Newcastle Uni. We do a bit of research around it. It's just in the last couple of years, you look at the trending graph in like footwear journals. It's just a massive spike with all the stuff and injury, and nothing yet with injury, but definitely easily for performance.
Well, there's a really good paper that's just come out. Make sure you turn your shoes over, those Vaporflies over reasonably quickly, because after about 450 kilometers.
The PIBA one with the PIBA foam, they were showing there was no difference compared to EVA, which is great for the footwear companies. That's just more people buying more shoes.
Well, I think it actually reversed the energetic cost. The one I saw that if you're using worn shoes versus the new ones, the worn super shoe will actually increase the energetic cost.
Wow.
Right. I think my Vaporflies are on about $450 at the moment.
Yeah,
I need to get
we'll have to go buy 8 pairs.
Yeah, you got to spare 80,000.
Yeah. Well, that new Adidas shoe, like, what do you think? I mean, from your understanding of things that can make people better performance wise, like, and the 40 mil stack, it's called shoe doping, or the research around all the media around the new Adidas shoe and it being $1,000. Like, do you think it's incredible to see how much of a difference they're making? Of course, the media overshoot it, but it's clear in the research there's a certainly noticeable difference for running economy.
Oh, look! Now that I've tried them, I wouldn't, unless I was intentionally trying to race in a fatigued state and intentionally trying to make the race harder than it had to be. I would not go without them. I would be using them every time because they give me, I would estimate 10 to 15 seconds per K. So yeah, like I kind of like them, but I don't use them all the time. I only train. I don't train them. I just break them out when I want to break.
Yeah, you just sit them in the mantle in the office, and then you kind of break the glass, pull them out, dust them off, and ready to go. Well,
my son and I, we do a race every year.
Oh, really? Like a 5K race?
Yeah, and it's a handicap race. So it's based on our PB 5K time. And we've got a shield and everything. So
that's awesome. What's that? So that's why you've been really into the running, like to make sure you get over top of him.
Yeah, well, he kind of got me back into it. I was running all the time, but he got me back into more the longer running. And yeah, I mean, it's such a great event. There's a lot of banter on social media. Like, I think people are more interested in the race than they are in the actual work I do. He won the first year, I won the second year, so it's kind of like the decider.
How old is he?
He's 26.
Right. Okay. Yeah. All right. I was going to say, if he was a bit young, you just say, "Oh, you're not ready for the super shoes yet." When you're a bit older, and you just keep them for yourself. Oh, that's good. That's
really good. Well, I was in Portland, and I went to the Nike headquarters, and the person who took me there, she said, "Look, I'm going to get you some discounts." So I got 50% off. And while I was there, I'm ringing him and I'm saying, I've got the opportunity to buy 2 pairs here because it's 2 for the price of 1. I'm getting myself a pair, but I don't think it's going to be fair if I race you and I'm wearing super shoes and you're not. Do you want a pair or
That's
not?
fair game. Yeah.
Yeah. You should have called him back and said,
Sorry,
I'm at the factory, but they don't have your size. I'm so sorry.
And so I got you a pair of Crocs.
Yeah. And I've just put some cement on the bottom for it to help out. Do you think you'll go up to the marathon or anything like that, or the half? Do you think you'll go?
Yeah, we're going to do one next year. We entered in. We applied to get into Tokyo. He got in and I didn't.
Yeah.
So we won't do Tokyo. We'll do somewhere in Europe, I think.
Yeah.
Berlin, maybe.
Berlin Marathon.
We're on Berlin Marathon next
Yeah, we're
year.
doing Berlin next year.
Oh yeah, it's pretty flat, isn't it, Berlin?
Yeah, fastest in the world. Fastest in the world.
Okay, that's my kind of course. Yeah.
No hills, no elevation. That's what we're about.
Yeah, I mean anywhere in Europe would be good for me. I think he'd like to do a big one, maybe Paris or London, or. But yeah, I think it's like now, like doing a race with him, this race every year. Doing a half marathon together. They're great memories. We've got some really good memories of the different runs that we've done and the different races, and it's a great event. This race we have every Boxing Day. It's a really good event.
You're still well after Boxing Day.
Yeah, not dusty or anything.
Yeah, not dusty.
No. Christmas Day pretty tame.
Yeah, well, see, I take it more seriously than he does.
Yeah. You're like tapering in, and you're sleeping. You can't sleep in the house. It's all these rules.
Yeah. Like he has a different kind of preparation than what I do, but he's a genuine racer though. He just
the
white line fever, just loves it. Just switches gears.
Yeah, really good racer. And for me, I kind of embrace the training aspect of it. Like today I'm struggling a bit because I did a pretty solid interval session yesterday, and so I've got to wait for 3 days before I go back and do it again because if you took my response today, I'm pretty sore.
Yeah, it's Saturday. You have to break out the Vapor Flies now. You've earned it because it's so easy to put them on. You just feel so much better. Like you wonder, do they increase the risk of injury because you can train more in them? Like you're just more likely to go out if you can put those things on.
Yeah, well, maybe you're right. I'm going to do a recovery run today, but maybe I should just give myself a little reward.
Take it easy. Yeah, awesome, mate. Thank you so much for coming on. We'll leave you to your recovery run, and we'll put all your social media and where people can find you. But yeah, thank you again so much for coming on. Thanks for chatting.
Yeah, my pleasure. Great talking to you both.